This is one of those builds that you need to add to your arsenal right now. Why? Well, to put it simply, it's basically a roaming version of Starfire Protocol Warlock, but for Titans. Along with throwing literally non-stop grenades, you've got infinite uptime healing, weapon damage, and ability regeneration buffs. And those very abilities will not only be hitting enemies like a semi-truck, but will also instantly refund themselves in the process. And if that wasn't enough to convince you, this build will also have you taking your super from 0 to 100 in a matter of seconds. If that all sounds exciting to you, and you are one of the 70% of viewers not yet subscribed to my channel, I'd appreciate it if you would consider joining the Build Crafting Club by hitting that button down below. With all that said, let's get into the build. It all begins with the combination of our fusion grenade and the Ashen Wake exotic Titan gloves, which enhance our fusion grenades by causing them to instantly explode on impact and allow them to refund grenade energy on grenade final blows. Specifically, for each red bar enemy killed, you refund 25% of your total grenade energy, 50% for each orange bar enemy, and 100% for mini bosses, champions, and bosses. But with some of the mods we will touch on later in the video, you'll learn that even by only killing 1 or 2 red bar enemies and receiving a 25 to 50% refund of your grenade from the Ashen Wake gloves, you'll still be able to rapid fire these things infinitely thanks to additional grenade refund from alternate sources soon to be discussed. But before we get there, let's talk about what happens if we do in fact misjudge our grenade damage or whiff it entirely. In that situation, ability number 2 in the throwing hammer is your next best friend. Not only does this hammer deal a pretty decent chunk of damage and can be used to buff our weapon damage with fragments we'll touch on in a second, but it can also be scavenged off the ground to fully refund your melee charge, allowing you to use it infinitely. Additionally, when scavenging your throwing hammer from the ground, you are granted the Solar Cure buff for a quick 60 HP heal. I also want to note that with this build, I highly recommend configuring your in-game settings to have your usual melee button assigned to both charged and uncharged melee rather than using auto melee, as auto melee will cause you to use your uncharged punch over your hammer when you're too close to enemies, which is typically the opposite of what you want to do. Now, admittedly, the damage of our fusion grenade and throwing hammer are not particularly mind-blowing on their own, but they certainly begin to raise eyebrows when we add our first aspect into the mix, Roaring Flames, which provides a stacking damage buff on ability final blows, maxing out at 3 stacks where it grants a whopping 73% ability damage increase. Additionally, while Roaring Flames is active, regular melee hits apply Scorch and count as powered melee hits, meaning if you accidentally lose your hammer, you can actually continue to stack and maintain stacks of Roaring Flames with regular melee final blows. And in addition to receiving a huge stacking damage buff from all ability kills, you'll also receive a lot more benefits through our second aspect, Soul Invictus, which generates sunspots at the location of defeated enemies in the case of all solar ability and scorched enemy kills, including enemies scorched from the incandescent weapon perk, and at the location of all Hammer of Soul impacts. A sunspot is a pool of fire that persists for 6 seconds, damaging enemies that walk through or stand in it, but granting you a whole slew of benefits when you do the same. Specifically, you gain the restoration buff for a constant 40 health per second heal, 40% decreased passive super drain, and 100% increased grenade and melee regeneration. That last one is communicated in-game through the Soul Invictus buff on your HUD, which lasts for 5 seconds outside of a sunspot and refreshes anytime you are in a sunspot, constantly refreshing if you remain standing in one. However, the restoration buff received from the sunspot will not refresh unless you exit and re-enter the sunspot. Now, most build videos would stop here, but I want to tell you another secret about sunspots that I guarantee no other build video will show you. Remember how I said sunspots last on the ground for 6 seconds? Well, their duration can actually be extended significantly simply by standing in them. The way sunspot duration really works is that it will stay alive for 6 cumulative uninhabited seconds. So if, for example, you create a sunspot, wait 3 seconds before standing in it, hop in it for a bit, and then exit again, you would have 3 seconds of unattendance remaining before it despawns. And although having an everlasting sunspot sounds awesome, it does have a hard despawn timer of 20 total seconds, regardless of how long you stand in it. And if that's something you didn't know before watching this video, I'd appreciate it if you'd consider hitting that subscribe button down below so I can continue to show you all of the intricacies of the best Destiny builds. Now, if it wasn't obvious from the benefits that these aspects both provide to it, our super of choice will of course be the Hammer of Soul, which with the mods we'll talk about shortly will be available for use non-stop thanks to the ridiculous amounts of super energy we'll gain from this build. But first, let's talk about the 4 fragment slots available to us to further juice up this already incredible setup. The first of these fragments is what will enable us to receive that weapon damage buff from our throwing hammer that I mentioned earlier in the Ember of Torches, granting Radiant a 25% weapon damage buff on powered melee hits. And considering that you essentially have an infinitely refundable powered melee ability, this is extremely easy to maintain. Fragment number 2 is one of the plentiful ancillary methods to regain grenade energy in the Ember of Benevolence, which upon applying solar buffs to allies like Radiant and Restoration, grants 6 seconds of 200% increased ability regeneration to all 3 of your basic abilities. This fragment will of course be activated through the use of the Ember of Torches, since when landing a powered melee hit, not only will you receive Radiant, but so will all of your nearby allies. Now, if you are looking to use this build in solo activities on occasion, this fragment is obviously extremely useless. So in those circumstances, I would recommend swapping it out for something else. Moving on, fragment number 3 is one that comes in absolutely huge for endgame content against tankier enemies. Currently, the only way you can refresh your Restoration and Radiant buffs is by running over sunspots generated from defeated enemies and by hitting enemies with your throwing hammer, both things that can't always be done on demand in higher end content with tankier and more dangerous mobs. However, Ember of Empyrean allows us to effectively maintain 100% uptime on both our Restoration and Radiant buffs by allowing us to extend them to up to 12 seconds from solar ability and solar weapon final blows. In accordance with this, you'll obviously want to do your best to pair solar weapons with this build to maximize the effectiveness of the Ember of Empyrean. Finally, filling fragment slot number 4 is the Ember of Searing, which refunds melee energy and spawns fire sprites when defeating scorched targets, which is great for getting your throwing hammer back quickly in the event that you misplace it, and for furthering the ways to refund grenade energy through the scavenging of those generated fire sprites. Now, we still haven't gotten to those previously mentioned ways that we will be able to guarantee full grenade refunds and constant super pops like clockwork. So allow me to answer those questions with our fully kitted mod setup. We'll of course begin with our orb of power generation methods, starting with firepower on the gloves for orbs on grenade final blows. You'll also want to snag harmonic siphon on the helmet for orbs on solar weapon multi-kills, since you should of course be running a solar weapon with this build. You'll then round out this orb generation suite with Reaper on the class item for orb of power generation on weapon kills after class ability cast. And speaking of class ability cast, thanks to 2 copies of Bomber on your class item, you'll refund a big chunk of grenade energy by doing so as well. And with 2 copies of Innervation on the boots added to the mix, you'll be able to refund a chunk of grenade energy on orb of power pickup as well, orbs that you'll just so happen to be generating with grenade kills themselves. And to throw the cherry on top, you'll slide 2 copies of grenade kickstart onto your gloves for a massive refund to your grenade on grenade cast, depending on how many armor charge stacks you have. But that's not all, because with stacks on the boots, you'll be doubling the amount of armor charge stacks you receive on orb pickup. And to make the most out of stacks on stacks, you'll finally slot a copy of Charged Up on your chest to increase your maximum armor charge stack capacity from 3 to 4. And just to note, with 2 copies of Grenade Kickstart and 2 Armor Charge stacks, you're automatically refunding 30.8% of your grenade on throw, which with 1 additional orb pickup for a total of 4 Armor Charge stacks automatically refunds 48.1% of your grenade on throw. And with all of these grenade kills that are sure to be occurring, it only makes sense to toss 2 copies of Ashes to Assets on your helmet for significantly increased super gains on grenade final blows. Couple this healthy mod ensemble with chest and stat mods of your choice, and you'll learn what it means to feel like Titans just got their own mobile Starfire protocol setup. And speaking of stat mods, I highly recommend prioritizing resilience, discipline, and intellect in that order. And as always, there is a Destiny item manager link in the description that you can use to copy all of these abilities, aspects, fragments, and mods over to your Guardian with just 1 click. And while you're down there, please consider tagging those like and subscribe buttons as well if you're enjoying the video so far. Now, putting this build to use is actually quite simple. Your number 1 goal is to try to maintain 3 stacks of Roaring Flames at all times to maximize your grenade and throwing hammer damage. Having both of these abilities consistently dealing 73% bonus damage will make it a lot easier to get grenade refund from Ashen Wake and to generate sunspots with ability final blows. And while sunspots are extremely important for acquiring the Soul Invictus buff to get a big boost to your grenade and melee regeneration when needed, you really only need to step in them once to acquire your initial restoration buff, since that very restoration buff can be extended and maintained outside of sunspots with solar ability and solar weapon final blows thanks to the Ember of Empyrean. An extremely key component of this build is obviously picking up generated orbs of power from solar weapon multi-kills, grenade kills, and post-barricade usage weapon kills to stack up your armor charge to fuel grenade kickstart. In most situations, it's super easy to tag up 2 red bar enemies with your grenade, which will refund half of it from Ashen Wake. And if you're diligent about orb pickup and have 4 armor charge stacks acquirable from 2 orbs when you throw that grenade, then the consumption of those stacks will easily make up that other half. And in team activities, do your best to tag mobs with your throwing hammer to grant your buddies Radiant, and in the process, activate your Ember of Benevolence fragment for increased ability regeneration. Now, I won't lie, this build is definitely tougher to pull off in higher end content like Grandmaster Nightfalls, where the mobs are much tankier, but it still remains incredibly strong and potent in the hands of a practiced user. In these types of activities where it is a bit harder to consistently one-hit enemies with your grenade, you'll simply have to be sure to make the most out of class ability usage, Orb and Firesprite pickup, Ember of Benevolence, and the Soul Invictus buff to fuel your grenade to the best of your ability. And while it is down, your fully stacked Roaring Flames throwing hammer still packs a punch. And in situations where even that isn't such a safe idea, like I said before, with all of the super energy you'll be generating from Ashes to Assets through grenade final blows, you'll always have your super in your back pocket should you need it. This build honestly made me laugh uncontrollably while discovering it on my stream due to the sheer amount of grenade spam that I was dishing out, and I hope you enjoy using it as much as you enjoyed this video. Feel free to stop by my live stream at twitch.tv/Mactics with additional questions. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, have a great day.